On January 2, 1944, a German sergeant named Reinhold Pabel sat in an upholstered Pullman coach somewhere west of Virginia, watching America pass by his window. He had not expected the seat. In the Wehrmacht, soldiers rode in boxcars, wooden floors, no heat, bodies pressed together like freight. But when the guards at Norfolk had pointed to the train, Pabel and 400 other prisoners walked into coaches with cushioned seats, armrests, and curtains. Then, a black porter came down the aisle carrying a tray. He offered them coffee and sandwiches. He said, "Please." Pabel would later write that in that moment, most of the men around him forgot every anti-American feeling they had carried across the Atlantic. But the coffee was not the thing that broke them. The thing that broke them was what they saw through the glass. The train moved west, and it did not stop. Hour after hour, Pabel watched. Factories with smokestacks running at full capacity. Rail yards stacked with locomotives. Trucks, brand new, not patched, not repainted, lined up in rows so long the end disappeared. Towns with lit storefronts. Cars on every road. Children on bicycles. Women carrying shopping bags as if there were no war at all. Pabel had fought in Ukraine. He had fought at the Volturno River in Italy. He had seen what a country at war looked like. Rubble, craters, women pulling carts through mud. This was not that. This was something he had no framework for, and he was not the only one watching. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 400,000 German prisoners of war were transported by train across the United States. They came from North Africa, from Sicily, from Normandy, from the Bulge. They rode through Virginia, through Pennsylvania, through Ohio, through Kansas, and almost every one of them pressed his face to the glass and saw the same thing Pabel saw. A country that should not have existed, not according to everything they had been told. If this story sounds like it belongs to you, if your father or grandfather served in that war, hit like and subscribe. It helps these stories find the people who should hear them. Here is what matters about those train rides. These were not tourists. These were not students. These were combat soldiers, many of them elite, who had spent years inside a system that told them one specific thing about America. And that thing was a lie. But they did not know it was a lie. Not yet. Not when they boarded those trains in Norfolk and New York and Boston. They knew it the way you know the ground is solid. Not because you tested it, but because no one you trusted ever told you otherwise. For over a decade, the Nazi propaganda machine had built a very specific picture of the United States. Joseph Goebbels, writing in Das Reich in August of 1942, described the American national character in two words: naivete and arrogance. Adolf Hitler called America a mongrel nation, too rich, too soft, too divided to fight a real war. A nation, he said, governed by a capitalist elite with strong ties to the Jews, incapable of higher culture or great creative achievements. This was not fringe talk. This was state doctrine. German soldiers heard it in barracks, read it in newspapers, watched it in newsreels. America was weak. America was decadent. America could build cars and make movies, but it could not build an army. It could not sustain a war across two oceans. Its soldiers, raised on comfort, would break at the first shock. And here is a detail worth holding on to. When President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress in May of 1940 and called for the production of 50,000 military aircraft per year, Hitler's advisors studied the number. They reported back to the Führer. Their conclusion: this was American propaganda, nothing more. In 1939, the entire United States military had fewer than 3,000 planes. 50,000 was a fantasy, a bluff from a dying democracy. Remember that number, 50,000, because what those German prisoners saw from the windows of their trains was the answer to that bluff. And it was not 50,000. It was almost twice that. But before a single prisoner could see a single factory, something else had to happen first. These men had to lose a war they still believed they were winning. And most of them lost it in the same place, a place none of them expected to be the beginning of the end. On May 13, 1943, in a valley west of Tunis, 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their weapons. Among them were some of the most experienced combat troops in the world, veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, men who had rolled into Paris in 1940, men who had chased the British across Libya, men who had believed with absolute conviction that the Wehrmacht was the finest fighting force on earth. And until very recently, they had been right. But North Africa had gone wrong. Supplies stopped arriving. Fuel ran out. The Americans, who 6 months earlier had stumbled at Kasserine Pass like amateurs, came back with more tanks, more planes, more artillery, as if Kasserine had been nothing more than a rehearsal. And in May, the trap closed. There was no Dunkirk for the Afrika Korps, no evacuation fleet, just 250,000 men standing in the Tunisian dust with their hands up. Most of them were angry, not broken, angry. They had been betrayed, they told each other, not by their own skill or courage, but by Berlin's failure to send enough ships, enough fuel, enough ammunition. The war was not lost. This was a setback. Germany still held France, the Low Countries, Norway, the Balkans, most of the Soviet Union. The Allies had not set foot on mainland Europe. There was still time. That belief, that the war could still be won, is something you need to understand about the men who boarded those trains. They were not defeated men rethinking their lives. They were soldiers who expected to go home, possibly through a prisoner exchange, possibly through a German victory. The idea that they were watching the opening scenes of their own country's destruction had not entered their minds. Within weeks of capture, they were marched to the ports of Oran and Casablanca. Then something logistically elegant happened, something the prisoners did not appreciate at the time, but would come to understand later. The Americans had a shipping problem. Thousands of vessels were crossing the Atlantic, loaded with troops and equipment, headed for the war. They came back empty. The U.S. War Department looked at those empty holds and saw a solution: fill them with prisoners. Up to 30,000 a month were loaded onto returning Liberty ships and sent to the one place on Earth where a prisoner camp could be built quickly, staffed cheaply, and secured absolutely. Not an island, not a fortress, a continent. The North American continent was, in effect, the largest prison on the planet. Germany's allies, Mexico and Canada, were both at war against the Axis. There was no neutral Switzerland to escape to, no occupied France to slip through, no underground railroad, just 3,000 miles of country in every direction, all of it hostile, none of it reachable without a car, English, and American money. 3 things no prisoner had. The ships took 10 to 14 days. The men slept in hammocks below deck, ate American rations, and argued about the war. Some of the hardliners, and there were many, particularly among the Afrika Korps officers, told the others that the Americans were deliberately routing the ships to avoid the parts of the coastline that the Luftwaffe had bombed. It was the only explanation that made sense to them. German news reports had said American cities were under attack. If the cities were intact, the reports were wrong, and the reports could not be wrong. Then, in June of 1943, the first transport ships entered New York Harbor. The men came up on deck, and what they saw silenced every argument on the ship. The Manhattan skyline, every tower, every bridge, every dock, stood exactly where it had always stood. Not a single building was missing, not a single window was broken. The Statue of Liberty was whole. The harbor was full of ships. Cranes were moving. And behind the skyline, smoke rose from factories that were clearly, unmistakably, running. German news had reported Luftwaffe raids on America's eastern cities. Some of these men had believed it, a few still tried. Maybe this was a different harbor. Maybe the Americans had rebuilt. Maybe the damage was on the other side. But deep in the gut of every man standing on that deck, something had shifted. A hairline crack in a wall they did not yet know was already falling. They were processed at camps near the ports, deloused, photographed, fingerprinted, given new clothes. Then the guards pointed them toward the trains. And this is where the story changes, because up to this point, these men had seen one city, one harbor, a sliver of the eastern seaboard. It was possible, barely, to explain it away. A capital puts its best face forward. Every nation does. What no one could explain away was what they were about to see for the next 4 days and 4 nights, as those trains carried them west through the full width of the American homeland. The first thing that hit them was not the factories. It was the food. At a rail stop somewhere in West Virginia, the train paused for 20 minutes. Guards brought boxes aboard. Inside, white bread, butter, sliced meat, apples, chocolate bars, and bottles of Coca-Cola. For men who had spent the last months eating tinned rations in Tunisian foxholes and stale bread on the transport ships, the sight was disorienting. One prisoner, on a different train, months later, would describe the American lunchboxes with a single sentence in his diary: He wrote that the lunch his captors gave him on the train was better than any meal he had eaten in the last 2 years of the Wehrmacht. But the food was only a symptom. The disease, from the German point of view, was what lay on the other side of the glass. As the trains climbed through the Appalachians and descended into the Ohio Valley, the prisoners pressed against the windows and stopped talking. What they saw was not one remarkable thing. It was the absence of anything that looked like war. Town after town slid past. Drugstores open, churches painted white, gas stations with cars lined up, women carrying groceries, laundry drying on lines behind houses with unbroken windows and uncracked walls. Every town looked the same, not damaged, not rationing, not afraid. Think about what this meant to a man who had left Europe in 1943. By then, the British Isles were scarred by 3 years of Luftwaffe bombing. North Africa was a wasteland of burned vehicles and collapsed buildings. The Soviet Union was a graveyard. And Germany itself, though most of these men did not yet know it, was beginning to burn under the combined bomber offensive that would eventually flatten 61 cities. War, in their experience, was something that happened to everything and everyone. It spared nothing. And yet here was a country fighting on 2 fronts, across 2 oceans, in North Africa and the Pacific simultaneously. And its small towns looked like postcards. Then the landscape opened up. Past the Ohio Valley, the farms began. And this is where something shifted in the prisoner's understanding. Not suddenly, not with a single image, but slowly, mile after mile. The way a man realizes he is lost, not when he takes a wrong turn, but when the road keeps going and nothing looks familiar. The fields were enormous, larger than anything in Germany, larger than anything most of these men had seen anywhere in Europe. And they were being worked, not by people but by machines. Tractors, combines, harvesters, moving across the land in rows. In Germany in 1943, roughly 80% of farm work was still done by hand or by horse. These men knew that. Most of them came from villages. They knew what a harvest looked like. They knew what it cost in human backs and hours. What they were seeing from the train was a country that had mechanized its food supply so completely that it could send 11 million men overseas and still feed itself. And feed its prisoners, apparently, better than the Wehrmacht fed its own soldiers. Then came the rail yards. Outside of Indianapolis, outside of St. Louis, outside of Kansas City, vast grids of track filled with freight cars carrying steel beams, engine parts, crated machinery, lumber, oil drums. Not dozens of cars, hundreds, lined up and waiting, as if the country had more cargo than it had trains to carry it, and it had more trains than any nation in history. A guard on one transport, passing through the Midwest, made a remark to a group of prisoners that several of them would later recall in different versions. He pointed out the window at a factory complex and said, casually, that this was not even one of the big ones. The big ones, he said, were in Detroit and Pittsburgh. The guard was not boasting. He was making conversation. That was almost worse, because by the second day on the train, a new kind of silence had settled into the coaches. Not the silence of exhaustion or boredom, the silence of men doing arithmetic in their heads and not liking the answer. If this was what the middle of America looked like, not the showcase coast, not the capital, but the ordinary middle, then the question was no longer whether Germany could win. The question was whether Germany had ever had a chance. Not every prisoner reached that conclusion on the train. The hardliners held out. Some insisted the Americans were routing them through carefully selected areas to impress them. Others said this was all for show, a paper economy, not a war economy. These factories made refrigerators, not tanks. They were wrong. And the proof of how wrong they were would not come from a lecture or a pamphlet. It would come from something the prisoners saw with their own eyes after they arrived at the camps, something that made the train ride look like a preview. Camp Concordia, Kansas, summer of 1943. The first buses pulled through the gate, and the men from the Afrika Korps stepped out into flat, dry heat that reminded some of them of Tunisia. They looked around. Wooden barracks, a mess hall, a recreation yard with a volleyball net, a library. One prisoner at Concordia, a man who had grown up in what he later described as a cold water flat in a working-class district of Hamburg, would tell interviewers decades later that his first thought was not about captivity. It was that the building he had been assigned to sleep in was more comfortable than any place he had lived in Germany. That was not unusual. Across the camp system, from Kansas to Texas to Nebraska to Arizona, The pattern repeated. 3 meals a day, hot showers, beds with mattresses, medical care, access to books, musical instruments, sports equipment, payment for work, not in dollars, but in canteen scrip that could buy cigarettes, candy, playing cards. The Geneva Convention required all of it, and the Americans followed the rules with a thoroughness that baffled the prisoners almost as much as the Pullman coaches had. But this is not a story about comfortable camps. This is a story about what happened to men's minds when they stepped outside those camps and went to work. Because work was the engine of the whole system. American farms and factories were hemorrhaging labor. 11 million men had gone to war, and someone had to pick the cotton, cut the timber, harvest the wheat, staff the canneries. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to work, as long as they were paid and the work did not directly support the enemy military. So tens of thousands of German soldiers, men who weeks earlier had been firing MG-42s at American infantry, found themselves picking asparagus in Wisconsin, stacking hay in Nebraska, rolling cigarettes in North Carolina. And this is where the education began. Not the formal kind, that came later. The kind that happens when a man trained in one system is dropped into another and forced to see how it works from the inside. A German soldier working a wheat harvest in Kansas could count the machines. He knew what it took to bring in a crop back home. Weeks of labor, dozens of hands, horses. Here, 3 men in a combine did the work of 30. He did not need anyone to explain what that meant. He could do the math himself. If this was how America farmed, then the food on the train made sense. And if the food made sense, then maybe the trucks made sense. And if the trucks made sense, then maybe the factories made sense too. And the factories were no longer theoretical, because now the prisoners could read about them. American authorities allowed German POWs access to newspapers, not German propaganda, American newspapers, printed in English, delivered to camp libraries. The decision was deliberate. Washington wanted these men to see the news. They wanted the prisoners' families back in Germany to receive letters describing what America looked like from the inside. Every uncensored letter home was, in effect, a piece of counter-propaganda that no leaflet drop could match. And in those newspapers, in 1944, the numbers began to appear. Here is one that would have stopped any German officer who understood logistics. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,359 military aircraft, not total since the start of the war. In 1 year, 16,000 of those were heavy bombers, the same B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators that were, at that very moment, turning German cities into ash. To put that in scale, in 1939, the year the war began, the entire United States military had fewer than 3,000 planes. In 5 years, production had increased more than 30-fold. But the number that cut deepest was not about planes. It was about tanks. In 1940, American factories built 331 tanks. In 1943, they built 29,497. That is not growth. That is not mobilization. That is a civilization changing its mind about what it wants to build. The men at Concordia and Brady and Gruber and Alva read these numbers in camp newspapers and American dailies. Some refused to believe them. The hardliners called it propaganda, the same word Hitler's advisors had used when Roosevelt promised 50,000 planes. But the hardliners had a problem. They could call a newspaper a liar. They could not call the sky a liar. And the sky over Kansas, over Texas, over Oklahoma, was full of aircraft. Day after day, formations of bombers and fighters flew over the camps on training runs. The prisoners could count them. They could hear the engines at night. They could see the contrails stacking up in the morning light like chalk lines on a blue blackboard. And some of them, quietly, privately, in letters they folded carefully into Red Cross envelopes, began to write. The letters began arriving in Germany in the autumn of 1943. They came on thin paper, folded into standard Red Cross envelopes, stamped with the return addresses of places most German families had never heard of. Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. Camp Concordia, Kansas. Camp Hearn, Texas. The handwriting was familiar. The contents were not. A wife in Hamburg opens a letter from her husband, a former corporal captured outside Tunis. He describes the camp. 3 meals a day, he writes, meat at most of them, white bread, not the gray sawdust loaf she has been eating since 1941. He tells her he has gained weight. He tells her he plays soccer on Sundays. He tells her, carefully, as if he is not sure she will believe him, that the American guards are polite. She reads this in a city where the firestorm of July 1943 killed 40,000 people in a single week, where entire neighborhoods have been turned to powder, where her ration card allows her 800 calories a day. Now think about this from the American side for a moment, because there is a reason Washington did not censor those letters. Every envelope that reached a German household carried a message that no Allied bomber could deliver. Your husband is alive, he is fed, he is not beaten, and the country holding him has so much of everything that it can afford to be generous to its enemies. The Americans understood, perhaps better than the prisoners themselves did, that an uncensored letter from Kansas was worth more than 1,000 propaganda leaflets dropped over Berlin. And the letters were only the beginning, because inside the camps, some men were not writing to their families, they were writing to themselves. Helmut Horner kept a journal. He was not an officer, not an intellectual, not a man with any particular axe to grind. He was an ordinary soldier from an ordinary town who had been swept into the war and deposited by the mechanics of capture and transport in the middle of Oklahoma. And in his journal, entry by entry, the war he thought he knew began to come apart. It started with small observations. The food, the guards, the American soldiers who came through the camp and seemed, to Horner, oddly relaxed for men fighting a war on two fronts. Then, the observations grew sharper. He noted that the Americans had an almost unlimited supply of weapons and equipment, while after 4 years of war, Germany was, his words, at the point of burning out. That phrase is worth pausing on. Burning out. Horner wrote it in 1944, while sitting in a camp surrounded by barbed wire in a country he had been told was weak. He was not a strategist. He had no access to classified production figures or intelligence reports. He was simply a man with open eyes who had spent enough time inside the American system to understand what the numbers meant. And what the numbers meant was this: Germany was emptying its reserves to keep fighting. America was filling its reserves while fighting. The two curves were moving in opposite directions, and the point where they crossed was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when. But here is what makes this story more than a tale of big factories and impressive numbers. What changed these men was not simply the quantity of what America produced. It was how America produced it. And that difference, invisible on the surface, was the thing that truly broke the last line of defense inside their heads. Germany in 1944 was producing more than ever. Albert Speer had tripled munitions output through sheer organizational will, dispersing factories into forests and tunnels, driving slave laborers from occupied territories to meet quotas. German engineering was still superb. A Tiger tank was a masterpiece. A Messerschmitt jet was years ahead of anything the Allies had in the air. But every Tiger took months to build. Every part was hand-fitted. Every engine required a skilled mechanic to assemble. When a track link broke in the field, a replacement from a different factory might not fit without filing. The system produced beautiful machines, and could not replace them fast enough to matter. The American system did the opposite. It produced things that were good enough, and produced them in numbers that made perfection irrelevant. A Sherman tank was not as good as a Tiger. Every German tanker knew that. But for every Tiger Germany could build, America could build 10 Shermans. And every part of every Sherman was interchangeable with every part of every other Sherman, anywhere in the world, without a file, without a mechanic, without a prayer. Some of the prisoners, the engineers, the mechanics, the men who had worked in German industry before the war, understood this at a level that went beyond shock. They understood it as a verdict. And then, quietly, without any announcement, the American government decided to make that verdict permanent. In the spring of 1944, a lieutenant colonel named Edward Davison sat in an office in Washington and studied a problem that had no precedent. Davison was a poet. Before the war, he had taught literature at the University of Colorado. He did not speak German. He had no background in intelligence, no experience in psychological operations, and no obvious reason to be the man chosen for what the War Department was about to attempt. But the job had fallen to him, and the job was this: figure out what to do with the minds of nearly 400,000 German prisoners who would, one day, go home. The concern was simple. These men would return to Germany. They would vote, work, teach, lead. And right now, a significant number of them were still Nazis. Not casual followers, but hardliners who ran the camps from the inside, beat prisoners who questioned the Führer, and held mock trials sentencing fellow Germans to death for treason. In some camps, the Nazis controlled everything: the barracks, the work details, even what men were allowed to read. American commanders, many of whom had no idea how to manage ideological warfare behind their own wire, often preferred the Nazis simply because they kept order. Davison's assignment was to change the trajectory, but the Geneva Convention prohibited indoctrinating prisoners. Any overt attempt at political education could trigger retaliation against American POWs in German hands. So Davison found a loophole: Article 17, which encouraged belligerents to provide intellectual diversions for prisoners of war. Intellectual diversions. That was the cover name for what became one of the most unusual operations of the entire war. In October of 1944, 85 carefully selected German prisoners were transferred to a former civilian conservation corps camp in upstate New York, then moved to Fort Kearny, Rhode Island. Every one of them had been identified through interrogation as a committed anti-Nazi. They were former editors, professors, linguists, writers. Men who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht against their convictions and had spent their captivity being threatened by the very comrades they now lived among. At Fort Kearny, they were given a task: produce a newspaper, write it in German, distribute it to every POW camp in the United States, make it smart enough to reach the educated prisoners, honest enough to earn credibility, and subtle enough to not look like what it was. The opening move in a campaign to rebuild Germany before Germany was even conquered. They called it Der Ruf, the call. The first issue went out on March 1st, 1945, priced at 5 cents per copy, because the Americans believed a free paper would be dismissed as propaganda. It sold out immediately. Within months, circulation reached 75,000. The reaction inside the camp split down the middle. Some prisoners read it quietly, carefully, hiding copies under their mattresses. One man wrote a letter to the editors, describing how a Nazi in his barracks had come to his bunk, pointed at the newspaper, and said, "Traitors, read this. If you keep reading, I will try to kill you." The man wrote that he kept reading. Others burned their copies. Camp newspapers controlled by Nazi editors ran counterattacks. In March of 1945, the factory staff, as the Fort Kearny operation was known, reviewed 80 underground camp newsletters and found 75% of them still carried pro-Nazi content. But the war was ending, and the end brought something that no amount of propaganda on either side could prepare these men for. After Germany's surrender in May of 1945, the War Department made one screening mandatory across all camps. Every prisoner was required to watch documentary footage shot by Allied camera crews at Dachau and Auschwitz. Footage of the gas chambers, the ovens, the stacked bodies, the walking dead behind the wire. The prisoners called these screenings Knochenfilme, bone films. Gerhard Hennis, a prisoner who watched one of those screenings, remembered the room afterward. The audience, he said, stared in silence. They struggled, and they were unable to believe what Germans, had done. Helmut Horner, the quiet diarist from Oklahoma, wrote his entry that night. The newspapers, he said, had poisoned the whole atmosphere with their reports of the concentration camps, whose existence they had no idea about. They knew Hitler locked up those who spoke against him, but the gassing and complete destruction of Jewish people, that was not known to anyone among them. Then he wrote one more line, 7 words: "I am ashamed to my bones to be a human being." That sentence was not about factories. It was not about trains or tractors or the number of bombers in the sky. It was about something much deeper. The discovery that the system they had served, the system that had told them America was the enemy, had been building something monstrous behind their backs while they fought its war. And it is here, in this intersection of industrial awe and moral collapse, that the most important letters were written. Not the early ones, full of surprise at the food and the guards. The late ones. The ones written by men who had seen both what America could build and what Germany had destroyed. On May 4th, 1945, at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, Helmut Horner sat with 2 friends, Siegfried Neumeller and Willy Hocker, outside the mill where they had been assigned to work. Neumeller had news. The Russians were in Berlin. The Americans were in Munich. Horner opened his journal that night, and wrote a sentence that would not be published for decades, but that captured, in 19 words, what 400,000 German prisoners had spent 2 years discovering. In the American state of Oklahoma, he wrote, 3 German soldiers listen to the clattering of the mill wheel and feel that they have lost the world. Not the war, the world. Hold that distinction, because it is the answer to every question this story has been building toward. These men did not merely learn that Germany had been outproduced. They did not merely learn that the propaganda was false, or that the camps were comfortable, or that America had more trucks and more planes. What they learned, slowly, painfully, one factory and one meal and one uncensored newspaper at a time, was that the world they believed in did not exist. The world where Germany was the pinnacle of civilization, where strength came from obedience and racial purity, where 1,000 years of Reich were not only possible, but inevitable. That world was a fiction, and the proof was not a speech or a pamphlet. The proof was outside every window of every train they had ever ridden across this country. The proof was a nation of mongrels, that was Hitler's word, who had built more, fed more, freed more, and fought more than his master race ever could. That is what they wrote. Not in one letter, not in one diary, but across thousands of documents. Letters home, journal entries, camp newspapers, post-war memoirs. The same realization surfacing again and again in different handwriting, in different camps, in different words, but always with the same quiet devastation. Kurt Vins, one of the intellectuals at Fort Kearny who helped produce Der Ruf, put it in terms that had nothing to do with factories. Had we only had the opportunity to read these books before, he wrote, meaning the banned books, the exiled authors, the literature that Nazi Germany had burned and buried, our introduction to life, to war, and the expanse of politics would have been different. That is not a man shocked by industry. That is a man mourning his own stolen education. A man realizing that the country holding him prisoner had given him more intellectual freedom in 2 years of captivity than his own country had given him in a lifetime of citizenship. In the final months of the camp's operation, as repatriation began, the Provost Marshal General's office conducted an exit poll of 22,153 departing prisoners. The result? 74% left the United States with a favorable view of democracy and a friendly attitude toward their former captors. 74%. Of men who had arrived as enemy combatants, men who had fought under the swastika, men who, in many cases, had believed every word Goebbels told them about America. And the ones who had been at Fort Kearny, the 85 intellectuals of the factory, carried something more specific home with them. Alfred Andersch and Hans Werner Richter, 2 of Der Ruf's most important writers, returned to Germany and kept publishing. They founded what became known as Gruppe 47, Group 47, a literary movement that for the next 20 years shaped the intellectual and moral conscience of West Germany. The men who had written a secret newspaper for prisoners in Rhode Island became the men who helped a destroyed nation remember how to think. Not all of them went back willingly. Some went back because they had no choice. Repatriation was mandatory, regardless of what a prisoner wanted. And some went back carrying a weight that no exit poll could measure. A man named Funke, cited by historians but never fully identified, was asked after the war whether the American re-education program had changed him. His answer was exact. No re-education had been necessary, he said. He and 80 men he corresponded with had become convinced Democrats, not because of a program, because of what they had seen, because of what America looked like from a moving train, because of what a guard said casually about a factory, because of white bread and Coca-Cola and uncensored newspapers and a black porter who said please, because of a country so secure in its abundance that it could treat its enemies with a generosity that, to a man from a nation of ration cards and rubble, felt less like kindness and more like a demonstration of something that could not be faked. But one man on those trains, the sergeant from the first part of this story, decided he was not going back at all. On September 10th, 1945, 5 months after Germany's surrender, while the rest of the prisoners waited for ships to take them home, Reinhold Pabel lifted 2 strands of barbed wire at a camp in Washington, Illinois, slipped underneath, and walked north down Wood Street to Route 24. He had $15 in his pocket. He had saved it over months, 5 from selling a wood carving to a guard, the rest from pennies earned running errands. He had a magazine article by J. Edgar Hoover called How Enemy Prisoners Are Recaptured, which he had found in the camp garbage and studied the way he once studied field manuals. Hoover's advice to fugitives, unintentionally, became Pabel's escape plan. Blend in. Do not hitchhike. Learn to speak without an accent. Get to a city large enough to disappear in. He hitchhiked to Peoria. He took a bus to Chicago. He had $6 left. Within a year, the former sergeant of the 115th Panzer Grenadiers had become Phil Brick, an American name he invented on his first night in the city. He found work. He learned to flatten his accent. He saved money. He bought a used bookstore on the north side of Chicago. He fell in love with an American woman. He married her. They had a child. They were expecting a second. For 8 years, Phil Brick sold books, paid taxes, talked baseball with his customers, and lived the life of a man who had looked out of a train window and decided that the country on the other side of the glass was the one he wanted to belong to. Then, on a morning in 1953, 2 men in dark suits walked into the bookstore. They asked if he was Reinhold Pabel. He could not deny it. They were FBI. The case that followed was unlike anything the American legal system had seen. Pabel was charged with illegal entry, but his lawyers pointed out, with a certain dark humor, that he had entered the United States entirely legally, as a prisoner of war. The government wanted to deport him. His neighbors wanted to keep him. An old friend came forward to testify in his defense, an American lieutenant named Paul Lindsay, whom Pabel had befriended at an aid station in Italy, years before either of them knew they would end up on the same continent in peacetime. Lindsay, now a lawyer, argued that Pabel was exactly the kind of man America was supposed to welcome. The court agreed. Reinhold Pabel was allowed to stay. He became an American citizen. He lived the rest of his life in the country he had first seen through the window of a Pullman coach on January 2nd, 1944. He was not alone in coming back. After repatriation, roughly 5,000 former German prisoners eventually returned to the United States as immigrants. They came because they remembered. Hans Wecker, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, came back, went to medical school, and practiced medicine in Georgetown, Maine for decades. Others returned to the small towns where they had worked, to Kansas and Texas and Nebraska, and were greeted by the farmers and families who remembered them. Some married local women. Some brought their German wives to see the country they could not stop talking about. And across Germany, in the years after the war, something else happened. The men of Group 47, the writers who had started at Fort Kearny, helped rebuild a national literature from the ashes. They wrote novels, essays, and criticism that confronted what Germany had done and what Germany might become. The secret newspaper that had been printed in Rhode Island and sold for a nickel in camp canteens had seeded something that outlasted the camps, the war, and the men who built the factory. But this story does not end in Germany. It ends where it began, on a train. Because what those prisoners wrote, in all those letters and diaries and memoirs, was not really about factories. The factories were what they saw. What they wrote about was the moment a man discovers that everything he was taught is wrong, and that the proof is not an argument or a book, but a country, stretched out beyond the window, mile after mile after mile, ordinary and impossible and real. They had been told America was weak. They rode through its strength. They had been told it was decadent. They ate its bread and worked its farms. They had been told its people were mongrels. They were handed coffee by a porter who called them sir. And when they finally picked up a pen, the words they wrote were not about shock or envy or even admiration. They were about loss. The loss of a world they thought they knew. And the discovery, too late and too far from home, that the world they had been fighting against was the world they should have been building. Thank you for watching this until the very end. If this story moved you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that history matters, and it pushes this video toward the people who need to see it. If you are not yet subscribed, now is the time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss the next one. I would love to know where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in World War II, on any side, I would be honored if you told their story in the comments. These videos exist because of them.